Careful, Judge. My father has destroyed careers for men who had more power than you.
Miss Ashcroft, you are still in a courtroom. Sit down and remain silent.
No. I'm done pretending this little room scares me.
This is your final warning. And I strongly suggest you consider your next action very carefully.
Good. Then, warn yourself.
Vivian flipped Judge Thorne off with a smug smile and held it there for everyone to see. The courtroom went silent. She didn't blink. She didn't apologize. Judge Thorne only looked at her hand, then at her face, and calmly opened the file in front of him.
Your diversion is revoked. You are sentenced to the maximum term permitted by law.
Vivian's smile disappeared because the man she had just mocked could make every word permanent. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The marble floors of the county courthouse echoed with clicking heels and urgent whispers as reporters pressed against the oak-paneled walls. Camera flashes bounced off the high ceilings like lightning in a storm. Everyone waited for the same thing: Vivian Ashcroft. The heavy glass doors swung open, and she entered like royalty arriving at a ball. Her navy designer suit fit perfectly. Her blonde hair was swept into an elegant twist. Diamond earrings caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. She walked with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. Behind her, Sterling Ashcroft moved like a man who owned the building. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His charcoal suit probably cost more than most people made in a month. He nodded at reporters like they were guests at his private party. Preston Vale hurried beside them, clutching a leather briefcase with white knuckles. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch. "Miss Ashcroft, will you apologize to Mrs. Brooks?" a reporter shouted. Vivian's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I'm here to clear up a misunderstanding." She didn't look sorry. She looked annoyed. The crowd parted as they moved toward courtroom 4. Vivian's heels clicked against the marble like a countdown. Sterling placed his hand on her shoulder, but it looked more like control than comfort. "Remember what we discussed," he whispered near her ear. Vivian nodded. Her eyes sparkled with the same cruel light they held when she shoved Eleanor Brooks away from the wheelchair ramp 3 days ago. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Eleanor Brooks sat in the front row, her right wrist wrapped in a white bandage. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She wore her best dress, the blue one she saved for church and special occasions. Her hands shook slightly as she folded them in her lap. Behind Eleanor, a dozen elderly tenants filled the wooden benches. Their faces were lined with worry and years of hard work. Mrs. Patterson clutched her walking cane. Mr. Rodriguez held his wife's hand. They had come to support Eleanor, even though they were scared. Vivian swept into the courtroom and immediately spotted them. She leaned toward Preston and whispered loud enough for several people to hear. "Look at them all lined up like vultures. I bet they think this is Christmas morning." Preston's face went pale. "Vivian, please." "What? They're probably hoping I'll write them checks just to make this go away." She laughed softly. "People who come to court begging always think someone owes them something." Eleanor's shoulders tensed. She kept her eyes forward, but tears gathered at the corners. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Malcolm Thorne presiding. Everyone stood except Vivian. She remained seated, examining her manicured nails like the proceedings bored her. Judge Thorne entered through the side door. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair. His black robes moved with quiet authority. His eyes were sharp and patient. the eyes of a man who had seen every kind of lie and excuse. He settled behind the bench and surveyed the courtroom. His gaze lingered on Vivian's seated form, then moved to Eleanor's bandaged wrist, then to Sterling's confident posture in the gallery. "You may be seated," Judge Thorne said. Everyone sat except Vivienne, who was already lounging in her chair like she was at a cafe. Preston tugged at her sleeve. "Stand up," he hissed. Vivian rolled her eyes and rose halfway, then sank back down with deliberate slowness. Judge Thorne watched this display without expression. He opened the file in front of him and read silently for a long moment. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, he looked directly at Vivienne. "Miss Ashcroft, do you understand the charge against you?" Vivian's smile was radiant and completely without shame. She tilted her head, like the question was amusing. Assistant District Attorney Grace Bellamy stood behind the prosecution table, her dark suit crisp and professional. At 45, she had prosecuted hundreds of cases, but this one felt different. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that made her skin crawl. She opened her file and looked directly at Judge Thorne. "Your Honor, the facts of this case are straightforward. On Tuesday morning, October 15th, outside this courthouse, the defendant deliberately blocked the wheelchair accessibility ramp during a public hearing regarding Ashcroft Properties development plans." Grace's voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom. She had learned long ago that facts delivered calmly hit harder than shouting. Multiple witnesses observed Miss Ashcroft positioning herself directly in front of the ramp entrance. When elderly residents attempted to access the building, she refused to move. Instead, she made loud comments about people who waddled to court looking for handouts. Eleanor Brooks's face tightened at the memory. She touched her bandaged wrist unconsciously. Grace continued, "The defendant then threw her coffee cup toward a group of senior citizens, splashing liquid on Mrs. Patterson's walker and Mr. Rodriguez's jacket. When Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, a 30-year courthouse employee, politely asked Miss Ashcroft to step aside so disabled citizens could enter the building, the defendant became aggressive. Vivian yawned dramatically and examined her diamond bracelet. Miss Ashcroft shoved Mrs. Brooks with both hands, causing her to fall against the metal handrail. Mrs. Brooks sustained a sprained wrist and bruising to her shoulder. The assault was witnessed by over 20 people and recorded by courthouse security cameras." Grace turned slightly toward Vivienne. This was not an accident. This was deliberate cruelty toward an elderly public servant who was simply doing her job. Vivian burst into laughter. The sound echoed off the courtroom walls like breaking glass. Several elderly tenants flinched. Eleanor's shoulders hunched forward as if protecting herself from another blow. "Oh my God," Vivian said loudly, not bothering to whisper. "She's making it sound like I committed murder. I barely touched the woman." Preston Vale grabbed her arm. "Stop talking," he whispered urgently. But Vivian was just getting started. She twisted in her chair to face the gallery, where her father sat with his arms crossed. Her smile was brilliant and vicious. "Did you hear that?" she called out to the room. "Apparently asking someone to move is now a federal crime." Judge Thorne's voice cut through her performance like a blade. "Miss Ashcroft, you will face forward and remain silent while the prosecutor speaks." Vivian slowly turned back toward the bench. But instead of looking chastened, her grin grew wider. She leaned back in her chair and studied Judge Thorne like he was an interesting museum display. Then she did something that made the entire courtroom gasp. Vivian crossed her right arm over her chest in a lazy, arrogant pose. She lifted her left hand and extended her middle finger directly at Judge Thorne. She held the gesture for 3 full seconds, her smile never wavering, as if the courtroom belonged to her family and she was graciously allowing everyone else to visit. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. A reporter dropped her pen. Mrs. Patterson covered her mouth with her hand. Eleanor Brooks closed her eyes like she couldn't bear to watch. Sterling Ashcroft's jaw tightened, but he didn't move to stop his daughter. His face remained stone-cold, calculating. Preston Vale went completely white. His hands shook as he reached for Vivian's arm again. "Jesus Christ, Vivian!" Judge Thorne's voice remained perfectly calm, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "Miss Ashcroft, I am giving you one warning. You will conduct yourself with respect in this courtroom or face immediate consequences." Vivian lowered her hand slowly, like she was doing him a favor. She tilted her head and spoke in a voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Respect?" She laughed again. "You people really do love pretending you can control families who actually matter. It must be so satisfying to sit up there in your little robe, imagining you have power over successful people." The words hung in the air like poison. Everyone understood exactly what she meant without her needing to say it directly. The cruelty was sharp and unmistakable. An attack on his race, his position, and his right to judge her. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. Grace Bellamy's face hardened with disgust. Judge Thorne studied Vivian for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled. "Miss Ashcroft, stand up." Vivian's smirk never faded. She remained slouched in her chair, arms crossed, looking at him like he had just told an amusing joke. "I'm comfortable where I am. Thanks." The courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. Vivian remained slouched in her chair, her defiant smirk aimed directly at Judge Thorne. Behind her, Sterling Ashcroft leaned forward from his seat in the back row, his eyes calculating as he watched his daughter's performance. Judge Thorne's fingers drummed once against his desk. The sound was barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a gavel strike. When he spoke, his voice carried no anger, only cold precision. "Ms. Bellamy, are there any sealed prior agreements that may be relevant to this case?" Preston Vale shot up from his chair like he'd been electrocuted. "Objection, Your Honor. Any prior sealed matters are confidential and—" "Your Honor," Grace Bellamy interrupted smoothly, pulling a manila folder from her briefcase. "The state filed a lawful motion this morning requesting review of any relevant diversion agreements. Miss Ashcroft's prior record is directly applicable to sentencing considerations." Vivian's smirk faltered slightly. She glanced at Preston, who had gone even paler than before. "What's she talking about?" Preston pressed his lips together and wouldn't meet her eyes. Judge Thorne accepted the folder from the bailiff and opened it carefully. The pages crinkled as he flipped through them, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched until Vivian started shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "According to this record," Judge Thorne said finally, 6 months ago, Miss Ashcroft was arrested for assault and battery against Maria Santos, a housekeeper at the Grandview Hotel. Is that correct, Mr. Vale?" Preston's voice came out as a croak. "Your Honor, that matter was resolved through a confidential diversion program." "A program," Judge Thorne continued, still reading, "that required Miss Ashcroft to complete community service, anger management classes, and maintain good behavior for 12 months. Any subsequent violent offense during that period would result in full prosecution for both the original charge and any new incidents." The blood drained from Vivian's face. She whipped around to stare at her father, but Sterling's expression remained stone cold. He had known this moment might come. "That's absurd!" Vivian exploded, jumping to her feet without permission. "That was nothing! Some stupid maid got in my way, and—" "Miss Ashcroft," Judge Thorne's voice cracked like a whip, "you will sit down and remain silent." But Vivian was beyond control now. The reality of her situation was finally penetrating her privileged bubble, and panic was setting in. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Judge Thorne, her voice rising to a shriek. "You don't get to do this to me. My father owns half the people who keep this pathetic city running. He owns police captains, city councilmen, people far more important than you'll ever be. You think that robe makes you untouchable?" The gallery erupted in shocked gasps. Several reporters started typing frantically. Eleanor Brooks pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes wide with fear at Vivian's raw fury. Sterling Ashcroft finally moved, rising slightly from his seat, but he made no attempt to stop his daughter's meltdown. His face showed cold calculation rather than parental concern. Judge Thorne set the file down and looked directly at Vivian. His voice remained perfectly level, but something lethal flickered in his eyes. The entire courtroom held its breath. "Miss Ashcroft, according to the terms of your sealed agreement, you were explicitly warned that any act of violence within the diversion period would result in full prosecution. You assaulted Mrs. Brooks while that agreement was still in effect." Vivian's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. The arrogance that had carried her through the morning was crumbling into desperate terror. Judge Thorne opened the sealed file again, his eyes scanning the pages with methodical precision. When he looked up, his gaze locked onto Vivian's face with surgical intensity. Maximum sentence. Vivian's face went completely white. The bailiff's keys jangled as metal cuffs clicked around Vivian's wrists. Her designer heels scraped against the marble floor as she stumbled forward, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. The confident woman who had strutted into the courthouse that morning was gone, replaced by a trembling girl who kept looking over her shoulder at her father. "Daddy?" Vivian's voice cracked as the bailiff guided her toward the holding area door. "Daddy, fix this!" Sterling Ashcroft remained seated, his jaw working silently as he watched his daughter disappear behind reinforced glass. Only when the door clanged shut did he finally move, rising from the gallery with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to getting his way through force. The courtroom emptied quickly, reporters rushing toward the hallway to file their stories. Judge Thorne gathered his papers methodically, his face revealing nothing about the earthquake that had just shaken the foundation of Sterling's empire. Sterling intercepted the court clerk near the judge's chambers. His voice was low, but carried the unmistakable edge of a man who had never been told no. "I need 5 minutes with Judge Thorne. Private conference." The elderly clerk, a thin man who had worked the courthouse for decades, shook his head firmly. "Mr. Ashcroft, the judge doesn't take private meetings during active cases. You'll need to file a proper motion through—" "I don't think you understand." Sterling stepped closer, his expensive cologne not quite masking the smell of desperation. "This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved quickly and quietly. Everyone benefits." "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Sterling's eyes hardened. For a moment, his polished mask slipped, revealing the ruthless man underneath. But then he caught sight of a reporter lingering nearby. Smartphone pointed in his direction and forced his expression back into something resembling civility. "Of course. Please tell the judge I'll be in touch through proper channels." Sterling turned on his heel and strode toward the courthouse steps, where a cluster of reporters waited like hungry wolves. He straightened his tie, ran a hand through his silver hair, and transformed into the grieving father his media training had prepared him to become. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice carrying just the right mix of sorrow and outrage. "What happened in that courtroom today wasn't justice. It was a vendetta." Camera phones lifted, news crews pressed closer. Sterling had their attention, and he wielded it like a weapon. "My daughter is a young woman who made a mistake. She was protesting peacefully when this unfortunate incident occurred. But instead of receiving fair treatment, she was targeted by a judge who clearly has a personal agenda against successful families in this city. A reporter called out, "Mr. Ashcroft, your daughter was convicted of assault." "She was railroaded," Sterling snapped, then caught himself and softened his tone. Judge Thorne made up his mind before he heard a single piece of evidence. Maximum sentence? For a first-time offender? That's not justice. That's persecution. Within an hour, Sterling's media machine was in full swing. Edited video clips flooded social media, showing only Judge Thorne's final pronouncement, stripped of all context. The footage made it appear as though the judge had sentenced an innocent young woman out of pure malice. Conservative blogs picked up the story. Talk radio hosts began their evening shows with outraged commentary about activist judges and reverse discrimination. Sterling watched the coverage from his penthouse office, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had turned disasters into victories before. This would be no different. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, ADA Grace Bellamy sat in her cluttered office reviewing the case files. Something nagged at her about the hotel incident. Maria Santos, the housekeeper Vivienne had assaulted. Grace pulled up the police report and cross-referenced the address. Her blood ran cold. Maria Santos had lived at 847 Elm Street, one of the apartment buildings owned by Ashcroft Properties. According to the records, she had been evicted for health code violations just weeks before the assault at the hotel where she had been forced to find work. Grace grabbed her phone and dialed Eleanor Brooks's number. When the older woman answered, her voice was shaky but determined. "Mrs. Brooks, I need to ask you something important. Have you or your family ever had dealings with Ashcroft Properties?" The silence stretched so long, Grace thought the call had dropped. "Mrs. Brooks?" "My sister lived in one of his buildings," Eleanor whispered. "Maple Gardens. They said she had to leave because of mold, but there was no mold. She died that winter. Couldn't find another place she could afford." Grace closed her eyes. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but she needed more. As she walked back toward the courthouse lobby, still processing what Eleanor had told her, she noticed an older black woman sitting on one of the wooden benches. The woman clutched a manila folder in her weathered hands and kept glancing toward the courtroom doors. Grace approached carefully. "Excuse me, are you waiting for someone?" The woman looked up, her dark eyes sharp despite her obvious exhaustion. She wore a simple blue dress and sensible shoes, but her posture spoke of quiet dignity and stubborn strength. "You're the prosecutor," the woman said. It wasn't a question. The one who stood up to that spoiled girl. "I'm ADA Grace Bellamy, yes. And you are?" "Nadine Carver." She shifted the folder in her lap. "I've been waiting for someone to listen. Someone who might actually do something about what that man's been doing to people like us." Grace sat down on the bench beside her. "What man?" Nadine's grip tightened on the folder. "Sterling Ashcroft. His company's been hurting seniors for years." Grace led Nadine through the courthouse's security checkpoint and down a narrow hallway lined with legal notices and faded photographs of former judges. The conference room was small and windowless, with a scarred wooden table and mismatched chairs that had seen decades of plea bargains and witness interviews. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Grace said, gesturing for Nadine to sit. "I know this can't be easy." Nadine placed her folder on the table but kept her hands on top of it. "Nothing about this has been easy. But after what I saw in that courtroom today, that judge standing up to those people, I figured maybe somebody would finally listen." Grace pulled out a legal pad and pen. "Tell me what you know about Ashcroft Properties." Nadine opened the folder with careful hands. Inside were dozens of documents, photocopied forms, handwritten notes, official-looking letters with Ashcroft Properties letterhead, and what appeared to be medical reports. "I've been collecting these for 2 years," Nadine said. "Ever since they started targeting my building. First they came for Mrs. Washington in 4B. said she had a gas leak that made the apartment unsafe. But I went up there myself. No gas smell, nothing wrong with the stove. She got scared and moved out anyway. Grace examined the safety complaint form Nadine handed her. The signature looked odd, and the report date was suspicious. Then it was Mr. Rodriguez on the first floor, Nadine continued. They said he needed special medical housing because of his diabetes. But that man's been managing his diabetes just fine for 20 years. Suddenly, he gets this letter saying a doctor recommended he move to assisted living. She pulled out another document, a medical relocation form with an official seal. Grace frowned as she read it. The medical recommendation was vague and generic, lacking the specific details a real doctor would include. Did Mr. Rodriguez actually see this doctor? That's just it. The doctor's office said they never examined him, never even heard of him. Nadine's voice grew harder. But by then, Rodriguez was so confused and scared, he packed up and left. Lost his rent control, lost his neighborhood, lost everything. Grace felt her stomach tighten. How many tenants are we talking about? In my building alone? 15 families in the past year? All seniors. All people who've been living there for decades, with protected rent. Nadine pulled out a handwritten list of names and dates. But it's not just my building. I talked to people from 3 other Ashcroft properties. Same pattern. Fake safety violations, phony medical reports, and when people don't leave, what happens when they don't leave? Nadine's expression darkened. That's when the security man shows up. Big white guy, maybe 35, always wearing a suit. He don't threaten you outright, just stands in the lobby, follows you to the mailbox, sits in a car outside when you go to the grocery store. Make sure you know you're being watched. Grace made notes as quickly as she could write. Did anyone ever report this to the police? Honey, what would we tell them? That a man in a suit was standing in a public lobby? That paperwork got filed with the city housing office? They'd look at us like we were crazy old people making things up. The weight of it was becoming clear to Grace. Sterling Ashcroft wasn't just a slumlord cutting corners. He was running a systematic operation to force out rent-protected tenants and replace them with market-rate renters. The beauty of it was its apparent legality. Every eviction looked legitimate on paper. Mrs. Carver, you mentioned Eleanor Brooks's sister earlier. Can you tell me about that? Nadine's hands stilled on the documents. Dorothy Brooks. Sweetest lady you ever met. Lived at Maple Gardens for 18 years. Never missed a rent payment. Then Ashcroft's people said they found black mold in her unit. Had to evacuate immediately for her health, they said. But there was no mold. Course there wasn't. Dorothy asked me to come look before she moved out. I've been a nurse for 35 years. I know what mold looks like, how it smells. That apartment was cleaner than most hospital rooms. Nadine's voice cracked slightly. But Dorothy was 81 years old and scared. They kept telling her the mold could kill her, that she needed to leave that day or risk her life. Grace looked up from her notes. Where did she go? Nowhere good. You know how hard it is for a senior on fixed income to find housing in this city? She ended up in a rooming house with no heat. Caught pneumonia in December. Dead by February. Nadine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. When Eleanor tried to ask Ashcroft's office about it, they said it was an administrative mistake. Like Dorothy's life was just paperwork that got filed wrong. The conference room felt smaller now, heavy with the weight of systematic cruelty dressed up as business practice. Grace understood why Judge Thorne had looked so controlled when Vivian mocked the court. This wasn't about one spoiled woman's tantrum. It was about a machine that ground up vulnerable people and called it legitimate enterprise. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Judge Malcolm Thorne sat alone in his chambers reviewing the court transcripts from Vivian's hearing. He could not investigate Sterling Ashcroft from the bench, That would create grounds for recusal and give the defense exactly what they wanted. But he could control his courtroom with surgical precision. Every document that came before him would be examined carefully. Every witness would be protected under court rules. Every lie told under oath would be preserved in the official record. He would not chase the Ashcrofts. He would let their arrogance lead them into legal traps of their own making. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unlisted number. Back off, or things get worse for everyone. Judge Thorne deleted the message without responding. Intimidation was just another kind of evidence, and evidence always found its way into the light. By evening, the county detention center had settled into its usual rhythm of clanging doors and echoing voices. Vivian Ashcroft sat in her holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of designer clothing. Her perfectly styled hair now pulled back with a rubber band. When the guard called her name for a visitor, she assumed her father's lawyers had arranged her release. She was wrong. Sterling Ashcroft sat across from her in the visitation room, separated by reinforced glass, and speaking through a prison telephone. His usual polished demeanor had cracked, revealing something harder and uglier underneath. "Daddy, thank God you're here," Vivian began. "When can I get out? This place is disgusting. And the food." "Shut up," Sterling said quietly. Vivian blinked. Her father had never spoken to her that way. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sterling's voice was cold, controlled rage. "Do you understand what your little performance in that courtroom has cost us?" The judge was being disrespectful. Someone had to put him in his place. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes hard as granite. That judge is now paying attention to things that should have stayed buried. Cases that should have stayed closed. People who should have stayed quiet. For the first time, Vivian felt genuinely afraid of her father. "What are you talking about?" Sterling pressed his hand against the glass partition, his knuckles white with tension. "Do you understand what you exposed today?" The next morning arrived with the sound of bullhorns and chanting voices echoing off the courthouse steps. Sterling Ashcroft had worked through the night, and it showed in the carefully orchestrated chaos that greeted anyone trying to enter the building. Paid demonstrators filled the sidewalk, holding professionally printed signs that read, "Biased judges betray justice," and "Political courts destroy families." The protesters were mostly young, mostly white, and clearly coached. They stayed just far enough from the building entrance to avoid arrest, while making enough noise to dominate every news report. News vans lined the street like armored vehicles preparing for war. Reporters practiced their segments in front of the courthouse, each trying to frame the story in the most dramatic terms possible. Sterling stood at a podium he had somehow gotten permission to place on public property, wearing his most expensive suit and his most concerned expression. "My daughter made a mistake," Sterling said into the cluster of microphones. But what happened in that courtroom yesterday was not justice. It was revenge. Judge Malcolm Thorne allowed his personal politics to cloud his judgment, and now an innocent young woman is paying the price for his bias. Behind him, the protesters cheered on cue. Sterling never mentioned race directly, but his word choices were surgical in their precision. He talked about urban resentment and activist judges and certain communities looking for handouts instead of taking responsibility. The language was clean enough for television, but ugly enough for his supporters to understand exactly what he meant. Inside the courthouse, the hallways buzzed with tension. Court staff moved more carefully, knowing they were being watched and judged. Eleanor Brooks sat on a bench near the elevators, her bruised wrist still wrapped in an elastic bandage, trying to ignore the whispered comments from people who had seen the news coverage. Anonymous social media accounts had spent the night attacking her personally. They called her greedy, dishonest, a bitter old woman looking for a payout. They posted her work schedule, her home address, and photos of her walking to the bus stop. The cruelty was methodical and relentless. Judge Malcolm Thorne entered his chambers at exactly 8 o'clock, the same time he had arrived every morning for the past 12 years. His routine never changed, regardless of the circus outside his window. He reviewed the day's docket, checked the evidence logs, and prepared for what he knew would be a crucial hearing. At 9:30 sharp, he entered the courtroom where Vivian Ashcroft's follow-up hearing was scheduled. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, elderly tenants, and Sterling's supporters. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vivian arrived from the detention center looking different than she had 2 days earlier. Her designer confidence had cracked. The orange jumpsuit and handcuffs were visible reminders that money could not make bars disappear. She kept glancing toward her father in the back row, but Sterling was busy whispering to his media consultant, already planning his next television appearance. ADA Grace Bellamy entered with a thick folder of documents from Nadine Carver. As she arranged her papers, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Sterling was not just defending his daughter anymore. He was using Vivian's case as a smokescreen. Every day the news focused on judicial bias and maximum sentences was another day the housing scandal stayed buried. Judge Thorne called the court to order with his usual calm authority. Before we proceed with today's matter, the court wishes to address several issues that have come to light since our last session. He opened a legal pad and spoke without looking up, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet courtroom. First, this court is ordering the immediate preservation of all evidence related to any housing complaints, safety inspections, or tenant relocations connected to properties owned or managed by Ashcroft Development Corporation. These materials will be secured by the court clerk pending further review. Sterling's lawyer immediately stood. Your Honor, we object to this fishing expedition. The objection is noted and overruled, Judge Thorne said without raising his voice. Second, both the prosecution and defense are hereby warned that any attempt to contact, influence, or intimidate potential witnesses in this matter will be treated as a serious violation of this court's authority. He looked up for the first time, his eyes scanning the packed gallery before settling on Sterling Ashcroft. The court is aware that certain individuals connected to this case have been subjected to harassment, threats, and public ridicule since yesterday's proceeding. Let me be absolutely clear about this court's position on such behavior. The courtroom held its breath. Even the protesters outside seemed to sense something important was happening. Judge Thorne's voice remained perfectly controlled, but every word carried the weight of absolute authority. Any person found to have engaged in witness intimidation, harassment of court personnel, or obstruction of justice in connection with this case will face the full consequences of the law. This court will not tolerate attempts to corrupt the judicial process through fear, money, or public pressure. He paused, letting the warning settle into every corner of the room. Any intimidation connected to this case will be treated as obstruction of justice. The rain hammered against the windows of the old apartment building on Maple Street like angry fists demanding entry. The hallway lights flickered with each rumble of thunder, casting shadows that danced across peeling wallpaper and worn carpet. Nadine Carver climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, her arthritic knees protesting every step. The folder of documents she had given to ADA Grace Bellamy felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her memory. She had done the right thing. She knew that. But right things in Sterling Ashcroft's world came with consequences. Nadine reached the 3rd floor and stopped. Her apartment door stood slightly open, the deadbolt hanging loose like a broken tooth. The hallway light flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, she saw movement inside her home. Her heart hammered against her ribs. In 30 years of living in this building, she had never forgotten to lock her door. Never. She pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The sight that greeted her made her stomach drop to her feet. Drawers hung open like gaping mouths. Papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Family photos lay face down on the coffee table, their frames cracked and splintered. The careful organization of her life had been torn apart by careless, cruel hands. But the worst discovery waited in the kitchen. Her medication bottles lay empty in the sink, their contents dissolving into a bitter, colorful soup. Blood pressure pills, arthritis medication, heart medicine, 30 days' worth of prescriptions that cost her nearly $200 each month, all wasted and ruined. "Evening, Mrs. Carver." The voice came from behind her, calm and cold as winter water. Nadine spun around and found herself facing a tall man in a dark suit. Caleb Drayton stood in her doorway like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did. His employer owned the building, after all. Two other men flanked him in the hallway, silent as gravestones. They never entered the apartment, never touched anything, never said a word. They didn't need to. Their presence spoke volumes about what could happen to elderly women who lived alone in old buildings. "I heard you had some excitement at the courthouse today," Caleb said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. He studied her ruined kitchen with the detached interest of someone examining a broken appliance. Documents and testimony, and all that legal business. Nadine found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "You had no right to break into my home." "Break in?" Caleb smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Carver, I think you're confused. Your door was unlocked when I arrived. Maybe you forgot to secure it properly. Old people forget things sometimes." He stepped closer, still careful not to touch her, still maintaining the pretense of politeness. "Old buildings like this one have so many problems. Faulty wiring, loose railings, slippery stairs, water damage from leaky pipes. The city inspector was just here last week, you know. Found all sorts of safety violations. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire." Nadine's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Accidents happen," Caleb continued, his tone never changing from that horrible, reasonable calm, "especially to elderly residents who might be experiencing memory problems, confusion about what they saw or heard. The stress of legal proceedings can be very hard on seniors, makes them imagine things that never really happened." One of the silent men in the hallway coughed softly. Caleb glanced at his watch. "I should let you get some rest," he said, backing toward the door. "Clean up this mess. Replace your medications. Think carefully about what's really important to you, Mrs. Carver. Your safety, your peace of mind, your ability to continue living in your home." He paused at the threshold, his eyes scanning her face like he was memorizing every line and wrinkle. "Old buildings have accidents, Mrs. Carver. Old people forget what they saw. Courts understand these things. They're very sympathetic to elderly witnesses who realize they made honest mistakes." The three men disappeared into the hallway like ghosts, their footsteps echoing down the stairwell until silence returned to the building. Nadine stood frozen in her destroyed apartment, her heart still racing, her hands still shaking. She held her ground until their voices faded completely. Then she collapsed onto her couch and wept. 20 minutes later, she called Ada Grace Bellamy. "They destroyed my medicine," Nadine whispered into the phone, her voice breaking. "They made it look like I'm losing my mind." Grace's response was immediate and fierce. "Stay exactly where you are. I'm calling courthouse security right now. We're filing an emergency intimidation notice tonight." Across town, Eleanor Brooks sat at her kitchen table, staring at an envelope that had been slipped under her door while she was at work. Her name was written across the front in block letters. No return address, no postmark. Inside were 3 photographs. Her grandson Marcus walking to school, his backpack bouncing as he hurried down the sidewalk. Her granddaughter Keisha waiting at the bus stop, checking her phone with the innocent confidence of a child who had never known real danger. The 3rd photo showed both children outside their school, laughing with friends, completely unaware they were being watched. No words, no demands, no explicit threats, just pictures of babies she would die to protect. Eleanor sat in her kitchen, holding the envelope with shaking hands, unsure if testifying would endanger the people she loved most in the world. The courthouse opened under different rules that morning. Security guards checked every bag twice. Metal detectors hummed with extra sensitivity. Armed bailiffs positioned themselves at entrances that rarely saw such protection. Judge Malcolm Thorne entered his courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock, his black robes crisp, his expression unreadable. The gallery was fuller than yesterday. Reporters sat in the front rows, their phones ready to capture whatever drama Sterling Ashcroft's money might buy. Behind them, elderly residents from Nadine's building huddled together, their faces showing the exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent wondering if morning would bring eviction notices or worse. Eleanor Brooks sat in her usual spot near the prosecution table, but her hands trembled as she sorted papers. Her eyes kept darting toward the courtroom doors, as if expecting someone dangerous to walk through them. She had called ADA Grace Bellamy at 6 that morning, her voice hollow with fear. "I can't do this," Eleanor had whispered. "I won't put my babies at risk." Now, as Judge Thorne took his seat, Eleanor rose unsteadily to approach the bench. Grace started to stand with her, but the judge raised a subtle hand. "Mrs. Brooks," Judge Thorne said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that made courtrooms go silent. "Before you speak, please be seated. The court has preliminary matters to address." Eleanor hesitated, then returned to her chair. Judge Thorne's eyes swept the courtroom, taking in every face, every nervous gesture, every reporter's eager expression. "This court has received credible reports of witness intimidation," he began, his tone as calm as if he were reading a grocery list. "Effective immediately, all witness addresses are sealed under protective order. Any attempt to contact, approach, or surveil witnesses outside of this courtroom will be treated as criminal obstruction." Preston Vale shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we object to these extraordinary measures. The defense has made no attempt to contact—" "Mr. Vale," Judge Thorne interrupted, his voice still level, but somehow more dangerous. "Does Ashcroft Properties currently employ or contract with an individual named Caleb Drayton?" The question landed like a punch. Preston's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted toward Sterling Ashcroft, who sat rigid in the back row. "Your Honor, I would need to review employment records to—" "Yes or no, Mr. Vale? The company has various contractors for security and—" "Yes or no?" Preston's face flushed red. "I cannot provide a definitive answer without consulting my client." Judge Thorne made a note on his legal pad, the scratch of his pen audible in the silent courtroom. "The record will reflect that defense counsel declined to answer whether Mr. Drayton is employed by Ashcroft Properties." Vivian Ashcroft sat in the defendant's chair, her designer suit replaced by standard detention clothing. For the first time since her arrest, she looked genuinely afraid. She watched Judge Thorne work with the methodical precision of a surgeon, each question designed to cut away another layer of her father's protection. "Furthermore," Judge Thorne continued, "this court orders immediate witness protection transport for any individual who has provided testimony or documentation in connection with this matter. Courthouse security will coordinate safe passage to and from all proceedings." Sterling's jaw tightened. He leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping the wooden bench in front of him. His media team had spent the morning flooding social networks with edited clips and manufactured outrage. But inside this courtroom, their narratives held no power. "Your Honor," Preston tried again, his voice strained. "These measures seem excessive for what amounts to minor disagreements about housing policies." "Mr. Vale," Judge Thorne said, cutting him off with surgical precision, "are you representing that breaking into an elderly resident's home and destroying prescribed medication constitutes a minor disagreement?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters began typing furiously. Preston looked like a man drowning in deep water. "I have no knowledge of any alleged—" "Then perhaps Mr. Drayton can clarify the situation himself." Judge Thorne's eyes found Sterling across the courtroom. "This court orders Caleb Drayton to appear tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to address questions regarding witness intimidation." For the first time since his daughter's arrest, Sterling Ashcroft's confident expression cracked. His face went pale beneath his expensive tan. His hands, which had been steady while directing his media campaign, began to shake. The trap was closing, and everyone in the courtroom could hear the sound of steel clicking into place. The courthouse gallery had never been so crowded. Elderly tenants filled every available seat, some leaning on walkers, others gripping worn canes. Their faces carried the weight of years spent fighting battles that powerful men had tried to make invisible. Reverend Samuel Pike sat among them, his steady presence lending courage to those who had lived too long in fear. Caleb Drayton entered the courtroom like a man walking to his own execution. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who knew the ground beneath his feet had turned dangerous. He wore a clean black suit, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator suddenly aware he was being hunted. Judge Thorne watched Drayton take his seat without expression. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff announced the continuation of proceedings. In the defendant's chair, Vivian Ashcroft sat pale and trembling, her earlier arrogance replaced by the growing realization that her father's empire was crumbling in real time. "The state calls Martin Ellery to the stand," ADA Grace Bellamy announced, her voice cutting through the tension. A thin, nervous man in his mid-40s approached the witness box. His hands shook as he raised his right hand to be sworn in. Martin Ellery had been a building manager for Ashcroft Properties for 8 years. Yesterday, he had been terrified. Today, with courthouse protection surrounding him, he finally looked ready to tell the truth. "Mr. Ellery," Grace began, "what was your role at Ashcroft Properties?" "I processed tenant complaints and coordinated building inspections," Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's not really what I did." The gallery leaned forward. Judge Thorne made a note, his pen scratching against the quiet. "Please tell the court what you actually did." Martin's eyes found Caleb Drayton across the courtroom. Drayton stared back with the cold intensity of a snake preparing to strike. Martin swallowed hard, then looked at the elderly faces in the gallery. "I helped get rid of people," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Old people, poor people, people who couldn't fight back." Nadine Carver pressed a tissue to her eyes. Eleanor Brooks gripped her cane so tightly her knuckles went white. The truth they had lived through was finally being spoken in a place where it mattered. "How did you help remove these tenants?" Grace asked. "Caleb Drayton brought me cash payments. $500 for each elderly tenant I could move out fast. $1,000 if they had medical problems." Martin's voice cracked. He said old people were easier targets because they got confused. They had less energy to fight evictions. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Thorne brought down his gavel once, and silence returned instantly. "Did Mr. Drayton provide specific instructions on how to accomplish these evictions?" "Yes. He told me to forge safety complaints, make up violations that didn't exist, schedule fake inspections during times when tenants couldn't be present to defend themselves." Martin looked directly at Eleanor. "He said if we moved fast enough, they'd be gone before they could hire lawyers or contact family. Sterling Ashcroft sat frozen in the back row. His face had gone ashen, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. His media team had spent days spinning narratives about activist judges and opportunistic tenants, but they had no defense against his own employee stating the truth under oath. Grace approached the witness box with a manila folder. "Mr. Ellery, I'm showing you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 12. Do you recognize these documents?" Martin examined the papers, his hands steadying as he focused on the evidence. "These are the forged inspection reports, the fake safety violations. I kept copies because I knew what we were doing was wrong." Eleanor Brooks let out a quiet sob. The sound cut through the courtroom like a blade, carrying years of pain that powerful men had tried to silence. Nadine Carver reached over and took Eleanor's trembling hand. "Your Honor," Grace said, turning toward Judge Thorne, "the state moves to admit these documents into evidence." Preston Vale stood quickly. "Objection. The authenticity of these documents cannot be established without proper chain of custody." "Overruled," Judge Thorne said calmly. "Mr. Ellery has identified the documents and testified to their creation. The objection lacks merit." The documents were admitted. Each page represented families destroyed, elderly people forced from their homes, lives shattered for profit. The evidence was building like a wall, brick by brick, truth by truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already calling it the biggest housing scandal in the city's history. Television crews crowded the marble steps, broadcasting live updates about the millionaire developer whose empire was collapsing in front of cameras. But Judge Thorne had seen too many cases fall apart at the moment of apparent victory. He leaned toward Grace Bellamy during a brief recess and spoke quietly. "This testimony is powerful," he said, "but no victory is safe until every document is authenticated and every witness statement is complete. Build the record carefully. Leave nothing to chance." Grace nodded, understanding the warning. Sterling Ashcroft had not survived decades in business by accepting defeat easily. The testimony had cracked his wall of protection, but dangerous men fought hardest when cornered. As the court session ended, Martin Ellery walked toward the exit flanked by courthouse security. His testimony had taken courage, but telling the truth had clearly lifted a weight from his shoulders. Caleb Drayton watched Martin leave, his cold eyes tracking every step. His hands remained perfectly still at his sides, but the fury radiating from him was unmistakable. The expression on his face promised that some battles extended far beyond courtroom walls. The courthouse steps were slick with evening rain as Martin Ellery walked between two security officers toward a black sedan. His testimony had drained him, but for the first time in months he could look at himself in storefront reflections without feeling sick. "Where are we heading?" Martin asked the lead officer as they reached the vehicle. "Safe house across town. ADA Bellamy arranged it through the state marshals. You'll be there until we can get your full affidavit signed and notarized." The officer opened the rear door. "Should be quiet. Nobody knows the location except essential personnel." Martin slid into the back seat, clutching a briefcase containing additional documents he had not yet turned over. Bank records, payment schedules, photos of elderly tenants being loaded into moving trucks, while Caleb Drayton supervised. Evidence that would bury Sterling Ashcroft completely. The sedan pulled into traffic as downtown lights blurred through rain-streaked windows. Martin felt lighter than he had in years. Tomorrow, he would sign the affidavit that would end Sterling's machine permanently. He never saw the truck running the red light. The impact crushed the passenger side instantly. Metal screamed against asphalt as both vehicles skidded into a concrete barrier. Martin's briefcase exploded open, scattering documents across broken glass and pooling rainwater. By the time paramedics arrived, Martin Ellery was gone. Grace Bellamy stood in the courthouse hallway the next morning, staring at her phone as reporters shouted questions through the glass doors. The news had broken an hour earlier. Key witness dies in apparent traffic accident. Grace? Eleanor Brooks approached quietly, her face pale with worry. Is it true? Is Martin really? He's dead. Grace's voice was flat with exhaustion and fury. Police are calling it an accident. Drunk driver in a stolen truck. Very convenient. Nadine Carver sat on a bench nearby, crying silently into her hands. This is my fault. I brought those papers forward. Martin died because I couldn't keep quiet. No. Grace sat beside her, fighting her own tears. Martin died because Sterling Ashcroft would rather kill people than face justice. That's not on you. But Grace knew the truth was worse than grief. Without Martin's signed affidavit, half their evidence became hearsay. Sterling's attorneys were already filing motions to exclude Nadine's documents, claiming they were stolen property obtained through illegal entry. Preston Vale had called an emergency press conference for noon. Grace could guess what he would say. The prosecution's case was built on questionable evidence from unreliable witnesses who had clear financial motives to lie. Grace, Judge Thorne's clerk approached carefully. His Honor needs to see you in chambers immediately. Grace found Judge Thorne standing behind his desk, watching a laptop screen with the sound muted. His expression was granite, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Have you seen this? He turned the laptop toward her. The video was grainy, clearly shot from a distance, but the image was unmistakable. Judge Thorne appeared to be sitting across from Nadine Carver in what looked like his private office. The timestamp showed a date 3 weeks before Vivienne's arraignment. Their conversation seemed intimate, conspiratorial. That never happened, Judge Thorne said quietly. I know, but it looks real enough to fool most people. Grace watched the clip again, her heart sinking. Where did this come from? It appeared on 6 different social media accounts simultaneously at 5 this morning. All anonymous. Professional quality. Someone spent serious money creating this. The implications were devastating. Sterling's team would use the video to demand Judge Thorne's recusal for bias. Even if the video was fake, the appearance of impropriety might be enough to remove him from the case. Grace's phone buzzed with a text from the courthouse press office. Sterling Ashcroft demands emergency hearing. Claims judge misconduct. By afternoon, the courthouse lobby crawled with reporters and protesters. Sterling Ashcroft walked through them like a conquering general, his confidence fully restored. Preston Vale carried a briefcase thick with legal motions. My client demands justice, Sterling announced to the cameras. This judge has clearly prejudged the case through improper contact with witnesses. No American citizen should face a biased court. Inside the courtroom, Judge Thorne listened as Preston Vale argued for immediate recusal. The fake video played on screens throughout the room. News anchors were already calling it proof of judicial corruption. Your Honor, Preston said smoothly, this evidence shows clear violation of judicial ethics. My client cannot receive fair treatment from a judge who has secretly collaborated with accusers. Grace stood to respond, but Judge Thorne raised a hand, stopping her. Due to the serious nature of these allegations, Judge Thorne said carefully, sentencing for Miss Ashcroft is postponed, pending a full review of all evidence and claims. Vivienne Ashcroft smiled for the first time in days. Sterling clasped Preston's shoulder like they had just won the lottery. Reporters rushed toward the exits to file breaking news stories. Grace felt sick watching Sterling walk out of the courthouse with his arm around Vivienne, both of them grinning as flashbulbs exploded. Eleanor Brooks looked crushed, her hope finally broken. Nadine Carver had not even attended, too frightened to leave her apartment. Martin Ellery was dead. The case was collapsing. Sterling Ashcroft was winning. That evening, Judge Thorne sat alone in his chambers, studying the fake video frame by frame. He had watched it dozens of times, searching for anything that might prove its falseness. The lighting looked correct. The furniture matched his office. Even his coffee mug appeared authentic. Whoever created this had spent considerable time and money making it convincing. But Judge Thorne had not survived 20 years on the bench by accepting surface appearances. He enlarged the image, focusing on background details most viewers would ignore. There, in the corner of the frame, barely visible through what appeared to be his office window, the courthouse clock tower was reflected in the glass, its face showing 2:47, but the timestamp on the video claimed the meeting occurred at 3:15 p.m. Judge Thorne leaned closer, studying the reflection more carefully. The clock was not just showing the wrong time, it was showing the wrong image entirely. The reflection was backwards, as if filmed in a mirror. His office window faced east. The clock tower stood to the west. From his actual office, the clock would be impossible to see, let alone reflect. The video had been staged in a replica of his chambers, built somewhere else entirely. Someone had constructed a fake courtroom to frame him. Judge Thorne closed the laptop and reached for his phone. Sterling Ashcroft had made a critical error. He had created evidence so perfect it revealed its own impossibility. The war was not over. Judge Malcolm Thorne arrived at the courthouse before dawn. The hallways stood empty except for security guards making their rounds. He needed silence to work methodically through what would either save his career or end it. In his chambers, he spread printed screenshots of the fake video across his desk like puzzle pieces. The backwards clock reflection was damning evidence, but proving it required more than his word against Sterling Ashcroft's money. At 6:30, he called the courthouse IT administrator. "I need a complete forensic review of a video file," Judge Thorne said. "Full metadata analysis, chain of custody documentation, everything admissible in federal court." The administrator, used to Judge Thorne's precision, asked no questions. "I'll have our certified examiner here within the hour." Judge Thorne's next call went to ADA Grace Bellamy. "Grace, I need you to pull building permits, lease agreements, and property records for every facility Sterling Ashcroft has owned or rented in the past 5 years. Focus on anything that might house film equipment or staging areas." Grace's voice was thick with exhaustion. "Malcolm, after yesterday, I'm not sure we can—" "The video is fake," Judge Thorne said quietly. "The clock reflection is impossible from my office. Someone built a replica of my chambers somewhere else." Grace was silent for a moment, then her voice sharpened with renewed focus. "I'll start with city permits. If Sterling built a fake courtroom, he would have needed construction approvals, electrical work, maybe even soundproofing. Be thorough. Be fast. And Grace, document everything through proper channels. No shortcuts." By 9 a.m., Grace had found the first lead. The city planning office showed an unusual permit filed 18 months earlier. Extensive interior renovations to an abandoned legal education center on the industrial side of town. The permit holder was Meridian Holdings, LLC, a shell company she had seen connected to Ashcroft Properties. The building had been a defunct law school annex, complete with mock courtrooms used for training exercises. Sterling's renovation permit requested authentic judicial chamber recreation for corporate legal education. Grace drove to the facility immediately. The building looked abandoned from the outside, but fresh tire tracks marked the parking lot. Security cameras perched on new poles. Someone had been using this place recently. She called Judge Thorne from her car. "I found it. Meridian Holdings renovated an old legal training center. The permits specifically mention courtroom reconstruction." "Do not enter the building," Judge Thorne said firmly. "We need lawful access and federal oversight." Sterling's people may be destroying evidence right now. Grace watched the building through her windshield, frustration burning in her chest. Evidence was potentially being shredded mere yards away, but Judge Thorne was right. Any contamination of the chain of custody would destroy their case permanently. Meanwhile, Nadine Carver sat in her apartment, staring at Grace's text message about the fake courtroom facility. Something about the address felt familiar. She had heard elderly neighbors mention that location before, usually in frightened whispers. She called her friend Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 floors down. "Dorothy, you remember when they took you to that place last year? The one where they said you had to sign papers about your apartment?" Mrs. Patterson's voice grew small. "They told me it was court. Said the judge already decided I had to leave. Made me sit in a big fancy room with wood panels and everything. I was so scared, honey. Thought I was already guilty of something." Nadine's hands trembled as the pieces connected. "Dorothy, do you remember the address?" "Wrote it down somewhere. Hold on." Papers rustled through the phone. "Here it is. Some industrial street I never heard of." The address matched Grace's location exactly. Nadine immediately called Grace and explained what Mrs. Patterson had described. Other elderly tenants had similar stories. They were transported to what they believed was a real courthouse, confused and frightened, and pressured to sign away their housing rights after being told their cases were already lost. "They used fake court proceedings to steal apartments," Grace said, her voice tight with rage. "Sterling didn't just intimidate tenants. He created an entire false legal system." Judge Thorne received Grace's report while reviewing the video's technical analysis. The metadata confirmed his suspicions. The file had been created using professional editing software, with multiple video layers composited together. The supposed meeting had been assembled from separate recordings, carefully matched, but imperfectly synchronized. He immediately contacted federal investigators, providing the metadata analysis, building permits, and witness statements through proper legal channels. Within hours, federal agents were en route with search warrants for the Meridian Holdings facility. Judge Thorne issued preservation orders for all Ashcroft Properties documents, froze Caleb Drayton's travel, and scheduled an emergency hearing for the following morning. He worked with surgical precision, ensuring each step followed federal procedure exactly. No emotion, no shortcuts, no mistakes Sterling could exploit in appellate court. At 4 p.m., federal agents surrounded the abandoned legal training center. Grace watched from across the street as they cut through chains securing the main entrance. Within minutes, agents emerged carrying boxes of files, video equipment, and computer hard drives. The facility contained not just a replica of Judge Thorne's chambers, but an entire fake courthouse. Elderly tenants had been brought here, terrified and confused, and told they faced immediate eviction unless they signed surrender documents. Sterling Ashcroft's deception was deeper and more cruel than anyone had imagined. Federal agents found tenant statements locked inside filing cabinets, along with videos of fake proceedings and Caleb Drayton's payment records to actors who had posed as court officials. The evidence was overwhelming, methodical, and absolutely damning. The holding room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Vivian sat across from Preston Vale at a metal table bolted to the floor, her designer clothes wrinkled from 2 days in detention. The confident smile that had carried her through years of consequences was finally gone. Preston spread documents across the scratched surface. His usual polish had cracked. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his expensive tie hung loose around his neck. "The federal agents found everything," he said quietly. "The fake courtroom, the tenant files, video equipment. Your father's operation is completely exposed." Vivian stared at the papers without reading them. "What does that mean for me?" "It means your assault case is now connected to a federal conspiracy investigation." Preston rubbed his temples. The fake courtroom wasn't just used to scare random tenants, Vivian. They have records showing Eleanor Brooks's sister was brought there before she lost her apartment. The words hit Vivian like ice water. Eleanor's sister. The old woman who died after being evicted during winter. Vivian had heard Sterling dismiss her death as unfortunate but unrelated to business. Now she understood the truth was uglier than even she had imagined. They made her think she was in real court, Preston continued, told her the judge had already ruled against her. She signed away her rights because she believed she had no choice. Vivian's hands trembled slightly. She had always known her father was ruthless in business, but this felt different. This was systematic cruelty designed to destroy the most vulnerable people in the city. "What does my father want me to do?" she asked. Preston's expression hardened. "He wants you to hold a press conference. Blame Judge Thorne for bias. Claim you're being persecuted because your family is successful. Make yourself the victim. And then you take the heat while Sterling's legal team works to separate Ashcroft Properties from the federal investigation. You become the distraction that gives him time to destroy whatever evidence the agents haven't found yet." Vivian felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He wants me to be the sacrifice. He wants you to be useful," Preston said bluntly. "Sterling has spent 40 years building his empire. He's not going to let it fall because his daughter couldn't control herself in a courtroom." The silence stretched between them. Vivian had grown up believing her father's money made her untouchable. Now she realized Sterling saw her as just another asset to be managed or discarded when convenient. "What if I don't cooperate?" she asked. Preston leaned forward. "Then you face federal conspiracy charges along with your assault conviction. Sterling's lawyers will make sure you're painted as the mastermind who corrupted an innocent business operation. You'll spend years in prison while he rebuilds his reputation." Vivian stared at the concrete wall behind Preston's head. Her father had taught her that power meant never apologizing, never backing down, never admitting weakness. But sitting in this sterile room, she finally understood the difference between real power and the illusion of protection. "I want to talk to the prosecutor," she said suddenly. Preston's face went pale. "Vivian, think carefully about this. Once you cross that line, there's no going back. Your father won't forgive betrayal." "My father already betrayed me," Vivian replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's using me as a shield for something I barely understood. I want to make a deal." Preston gathered his papers with shaking hands. "I'll need to contact Ada Bellamy and arrange a proffer session. But understand this. Judge Thorne won't let cooperation erase what you did to Eleanor Brooks. You'll still face consequences for your actions." "I know," Vivian said quietly. "Maybe it's time I did." Within an hour, Grace Bellamy sat across from Vivian in the same holding room. Judge Thorne had authorized the cooperation session, but made his position clear through the attorneys. Truth would be considered, but justice for Eleanor remained non-negotiable. "Before we begin," Grace said, "you need to understand that cooperation means complete honesty. No performances, no manipulation. If you lie even once, this agreement is void." Vivian nodded slowly. For the first time in her life, she couldn't rely on charm or money or her father's influence. She had only the truth to offer, and even that might not be enough to save her. "Tell me about your father's document storage," Grace said, pulling out a recorder. Vivian took a deep breath and signed the proffer agreement. Then she gave Grace the address of Sterling's hidden vault, buried deep in the basement of an Ashcroft Properties office building downtown. The morning air crackled with tension as Sterling Ashcroft walked through the courthouse lobby like a man who owned every marble tile beneath his feet. Camera flashes exploded around him, while reporters shouted questions he ignored with practiced ease. His navy suit was perfectly pressed, His silver hair gleamed under the harsh lights, and his smile radiated the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight that truly mattered. "Mr. Ashcroft, are you confident Judge Thorne will recuse himself?" a reporter called out. Sterling paused at the courtroom doors and turned toward the cameras. "I have complete faith that justice will prevail today. No judge is above accountability, and no courtroom should become a weapon against successful families." He pushed through the doors with Preston Vale trailing behind, both men carrying briefcases that seemed heavier than usual. Sterling nodded to familiar faces in the gallery, business partners, political allies, and journalists who had spent years printing his version of every story. Today felt like another inevitable victory. Judge Malcolm Thorne entered the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock, his black robes flowing behind him as he took the bench with the same calm precision he had shown every day of this case. The packed gallery fell silent, but Sterling remained relaxed in the front row. He had seen judges fold under pressure before. Money, influence, and public scrutiny always found their breaking point. "Mr. Vale," Judge Thorne said, "you may present your recusal motion." Preston stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defense moves for your immediate recusal, based on clear evidence of bias and improper contact with prosecution witnesses. The video evidence clearly shows—" "The video evidence," Judge Thorne interrupted quietly, "has been forensically examined by federal investigators. Ms. Bellamy?" Grace Bellamy rose from the prosecutor's table with a thick folder in her hands. She walked to the evidence table with the measured steps of someone who had spent weeks building an unbreakable foundation. "Your Honor, the state presents authenticated proof that the alleged meeting between this court and witness Nadine Carver was fabricated using a replica courtroom facility." Grace opened the folder and began placing documents on the evidence table. Exhibit A. The lease agreement for 1247 Industrial Boulevard, signed by Caleb Drayton on behalf of Ashcroft Properties. Exhibit B. Video metadata proving the timestamp manipulation and digital editing. Exhibit C. Payment records showing Mr. Drayton's cash transactions with the facility manager. Sterling's smile flickered for the first time. Preston grabbed his arm, but Sterling shook him off, his eyes fixed on the mounting evidence. Exhibit D, Grace continued, building access logs showing Mr. Drayton entered the facility at the exact time the fake video was recorded. Exhibit E, witness statements from elderly tenants who were brought to the replica courtroom and told they had already lost their cases. And Exhibit F, additional files recovered from Ashcroft Properties' hidden document vault. The last line hit Sterling like a physical blow. His face went white as he realized Vivian had given them everything. Every secret file, every buried contract, every piece of evidence he had spent millions keeping locked away. Judge Thorne studied the documents with the same methodical care he had shown throughout the case. The recusal motion is denied. The alleged bias was manufactured through criminal fraud. Mr. Drayton, please take the stand. Caleb Drayton rose from the gallery, his massive frame moving slowly toward the witness box. His usual cold confidence had been replaced by something more desperate. Sterling watched his enforcer with growing alarm, recognizing the look of a man who was about to break under pressure. "Mr. Drayton," Grace began after he was sworn in, "are you employed by Ashcroft Properties?" "I provide security consulting services," Caleb replied carefully. "Did you lease the facility at 1247 Industrial Boulevard?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't recall signing any lease." Grace held up the document. "This lease bears your signature and was notarized 6 months ago. Anyone can forge a signature." Judge Thorne leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Drayton, are you testifying under oath that this document was forged?" "Yes, Your Honor." "I've never seen that building before." Grace smiled, and introduced the next exhibit: security camera footage showing Caleb entering and leaving the building repeatedly over several months. The gallery murmured as his lies crumbled in real time. "Mr. Drayton," Judge Thorne said with deadly calm, "you are under oath. Did you bring elderly tenants to that facility and tell them they were in legal proceedings?" Caleb looked toward Sterling, seeking guidance that would never come. "No, Your Honor. That's completely false." Grace produced signed statements from 3 elderly tenants identifying Caleb by name and describing how he had terrified them in the fake courtroom. Eleanor Brooks sat in the front row, watching her sister's tormentor destroy himself with every lie. Judge Thorne had heard enough. "Bailiff, please place Mr. Drayton under arrest for perjury and obstruction of justice." The courtroom erupted as bailiffs moved toward Caleb. Sterling shot to his feet, finally understanding that his shield was gone and his enforcer had become evidence against him. "This is a witch hunt," Sterling shouted. "You're destroying an innocent man's testimony." Judge Thorne's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mr. Ashcroft, sit down or be held in contempt." But Sterling was already moving toward the exit, pushing past reporters and spectators. He reached the center aisle before the courtroom doors opened and federal agents in dark suits stepped inside, blocking both entrances. "Sterling Ashcroft," the lead agent announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering." The gallery fell silent as handcuffs clicked around Sterling's wrists in front of the reporters who had spent years printing his lies. Vivienne watched from the defendant's table, her face pale but her eyes steady, as her father finally faced consequences he could not buy his way out of. The courtroom remained frozen for several heartbeats after the federal agents escorted Sterling Ashcroft through the doors. Reporters strained against the gallery railing, desperate to follow the story outside, but Judge Thorne's voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. "This court remains in session. We will now proceed with Miss Ashcroft's sentencing review." Vivienne stood behind the defendant's table, her hands trembling as she gripped the wooden edge. The navy suit that had made her feel untouchable now hung on her like a costume from a play she no longer understood. Her father's arrest had stripped away the last illusion that money could bend reality to her will. Judge Thorne shuffled through the papers before him with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout the case. "Miss Ashcroft, your cooperation in exposing criminal activity will be noted in the record. However, this court does not confuse usefulness with innocence." Preston Vale rose beside her, his face gray with exhaustion. "Your Honor, my client's assistance has been invaluable in—" "Your client assaulted an elderly court officer," Judge Thorne interrupted. "She mocked vulnerable citizens. She showed contempt for this court and for the law itself. Cooperation may mitigate punishment, but it does not erase harm." ADA Grace Bellamy stood and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, the state requests that victim impact statements be heard before sentencing." Judge Thorne nodded. "Mrs. Brooks, would you like to address the court?" Eleanor Brooks rose slowly from the front row, her cane tapping against the marble floor as she approached the witness stand. At 67, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate a world that often dismissed her, but her voice carried 30 years of courthouse authority. "Your Honor," Eleanor began, her words clear and measured, "Miss Ashcroft didn't just hurt my wrist that day. She tried to hurt my spirit. She looked at me and saw someone she could push around because I'm old and black and work for a living. She wanted me to feel small." Vivian's eyes filled with tears, but Eleanor continued without looking at her. "I've worked in this courthouse for 30 years. I've helped scared people fill out papers. I've comforted families during the worst days of their lives. I've served judges and attorneys and defendants with respect, because I believe in what this building represents. But Miss Ashcroft treated me like I was nothing, like my life didn't matter. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. She didn't just attack me. She attacked every senior citizen her father pushed out of their homes. Every worker who gets treated like furniture by rich people. Every person who believes the law should protect the weak instead of just serving the powerful. The gallery was silent except for the soft scratch of reporters' pens. Vivian wiped her eyes with a tissue Preston handed her, but Judge Thorne's attention remained focused on Eleanor. "Mrs. Carver," Judge Thorne said, "would you also like to address the court?" Nadine Carver stood from the third row, her folder of documents clutched against her chest like a shield. "Your Honor, I'm here for the people who can't speak anymore. Eleanor's sister, who died after being scared out of her apartment. Mrs. Washington, who signed away her rights in that fake courtroom because she thought she had no choice. Mr. Torres, who lived in his car for 3 weeks because Ashcroft's people told him his lease was invalid." Nadine's voice shook with controlled anger. "Miss Ashcroft laughed at us outside this courthouse. She threw coffee and called us beggars. But we weren't begging. We were asking for justice. We were asking to be treated like human beings instead of obstacles to her family's profits." She turned toward Vivienne for the first time. "You didn't see people when you looked at us. You saw problems, inconveniences, things to be moved out of your way." Vivienne stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything. I know I was wrong. I know my father was wrong. I want to make it right." Eleanor Brooks met her eyes from the witness stand. "Sorry is what you say after you tell the truth, child. You're just beginning to understand what the truth looks like." The words landed like a physical blow. Vivian sank back into her chair, finally comprehending that apologies meant nothing without accountability. Judge Thorne reviewed the sentencing guidelines one final time. "Miss Ashcroft, please stand." She rose on unsteady legs, Preston beside her. "The court sentences you to 6 months in county detention, followed by 18 months of supervised probation. You will pay restitution to Mrs. Brooks and perform 200 hours of community service within this courthouse system, supervised by court personnel. You will issue a written public apology to court staff and appear at a community meeting to address the tenants affected by your family's actions." Vivian's legs nearly buckled. 6 months in jail. Real consequences that money could not erase. Judge Thorne continued, his voice steady and implacable. "Furthermore, Ashcroft Properties accounts are hereby frozen pending federal investigation. Emergency receivership will be established for all residential properties to ensure tenant protection. Mr. Drayton remains in federal custody." The consequences were immediate and visible. Sterling's empire was crumbling in real time, his victims were being heard, and his daughter was finally learning that actions carried weight. Bailiffs approached Vivian as she began to cry, not the calculated tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the broken sobs of a person whose entire worldview had collapsed in a single morning. Eleanor Brooks stood upright in the gallery, watching as Vivian was led away in handcuffs. For the first time in months, the elderly woman felt something she had almost forgotten: the solid, unshakable certainty that someone in power had actually listened to her voice. Several weeks later, Judge Malcolm Thorne's courtroom buzzed with quiet energy as families filled the gallery for the public housing restitution hearing. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces that had spent months living in fear and uncertainty. Today, those same faces carried hope. Nadine Carver sat in the front row, her folder of documents now part of an official court record that had toppled an empire. Beside her, Mrs. Washington clutched a letter confirming her right to return to her apartment with back rent, forgiven. Mr. Torres held his grandson's hand, both of them smiling at the prospect of stable housing for the first time in months. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Thorne began, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had terrified Sterling Ashcroft weeks earlier, "we are here to ensure that justice extends beyond punishment to restoration." ADA Grace Bellamy stood at the prosecutor's table, no longer fighting uphill against Sterling's influence. "Your Honor, the emergency receivership has identified 43 seniors who were illegally displaced from Ashcroft properties. Each will receive immediate housing review, financial compensation for moving expenses, and access to the newly established Tenant Defense Fund." Reverend Samuel Pike rose from the gallery when his name was called. The elderly pastor's church had become a sanctuary for displaced families, and now federal funds would formalize that protection. "Your Honor," he said, his voice warm with gratitude, "this support will help us shelter families during legal disputes and ensure no senior faces homelessness while seeking justice." Judge Thorne nodded approvingly. The court recognizes Reverend Pike's congregation for their service to vulnerable community members. The funding is approved and will be administered through proper oversight. Near the back of the courtroom, Eleanor Brooks moved quietly among the families, helping them understand their paperwork and navigate the complex restitution process. Her wrist had healed completely, but more importantly, her dignity had been restored. Courthouse staff greeted her with genuine warmth, and the families she assisted looked at her with respect rather than pity. At a small desk near the court clerk's station, Vivian Ashcroft sat hunched over filing boxes, organizing records as part of her supervised community service. Gone were the designer clothes and arrogant smirk. She wore simple gray pants and a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a functional ponytail. The young woman who had once mocked courthouse staff now worked quietly beside them, learning their names and witnessing their daily dedication to serving the public. Vivian looked up as Eleanor approached an elderly Hispanic man who was struggling to read a housing restoration form. The man's hands shook as he pointed to sections he didn't understand, his English halting and uncertain. "Don't worry, Mr. Garcia," Eleanor said gently, sitting beside him. "This form says your apartment is yours again. No one can take it away this time. See this number here? That's how much money they owe you for the trouble they caused." The man's eyes filled with tears of relief. Eleanor handed him a tissue and continued explaining each section patiently, her voice never condescending or rushed. Vivian watched this interaction without interrupting. For the first time in her privileged life, she simply observed someone else's kindness without making it about herself. She had learned that listening was harder than talking, and that dignity came from service rather than status. Judge Thorne completed the final restitution order, his signature authorizing immediate payments to families who had been forced from their homes. The bureaucratic language carried real power now, power to restore lives rather than destroy them. As the hearing concluded, families gathered their papers and prepared to reclaim their futures. The courthouse that had once seemed like a fortress protecting the wealthy now functioned as it was designed, a place where truth mattered more than money. A well-dressed attorney in an expensive suit approached the bench, clearly expecting preferential treatment. He spoke rapidly about his client's urgent schedule and the need to expedite proceedings without proper documentation review. Judge Thorne looked over his glasses with that familiar expression of patient authority. This court has time for the truth. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.